The 1958 World Cup qualifiers showed some signs of interest. 5 AFC nations entered to participate. However, these qualifiers were marred by the amount of teams that withdrew because of one team, Israel. So, in case you don't remember, even during this time, the CAF and AFC were still grouped together in the single qualifiers in which only one team could qualify. So, for the AFC part, Indonesia, China, Republic of China, Syria, and Israel all entered. The Republic of China withdrew in the first round, most likely due to the fact that they were in the same group with China, and given their past history, it's no surprise. So, in the group, that left Indonesia and China, who would each have a win against each other, and that led to a third match. They tied that match, so they just decided to give Indonesia the win because reasons. For Group 2, this is where Israel was placed to face Turkey. Turkey wanted nothing to do with Israel, so they withdrew, giving Israel a bye into the second round. In Group 4, Syria was placed to face Sudan, in which they were unfortunately eliminated by Sudan. So, in the second round, Israel, Egypt, Sudan, and Indonesia were scheduled to play. However, Egypt and Indonesia wanted nothing to do with Israel and withdrew, giving Sudan and Israel a bye into the final round. Sudan and Israel would face off for the sole ticket to the World Cup. Or rather, they were scheduled to face off, but Sudan also wanted nothing to do with Israel and subsequently withdrew also, giving Israel the ticket to the World Cup Interconfederation playoff against Wales, since FIFA put a rule by this point that no one can qualify to the World Cup unless they play at least one qualifier. Unfortunately, Israel was beaten, and that meant no AFC team qualified to this World Cup. So, I do want to note this, that the withdrawal of the nations against Israel wasn't a I just feel like it. The legitimate reason is that there was a thing called the Arab League Boycott of Israel, which was a group of nations that refused to do anything politically, culturally, socially, financially, nothing with Israel. So if you want to learn more about that, just search it on the internet. This is not the video for that. For the 1962 World Cup qualifiers, AFC finally had their own qualifiers. The downside was that whoever won the AFC qualifiers would have to face a European team in an Interconfederation playoff for a spot at the World Cup. South Korea, Japan, and Indonesia all initially joined, but Indonesia withdrew, leaving only South Korea and Japan to battle it out. In the end, South Korea would come out on top and would have to face Yugoslavia in the Interconfederation playoff. And unfortunately, South Korea lost both matches, so no AFC team at the 1962 World Cup. For the 1966 World Cup qualifiers, the football federations of AFC, CAF, and OFC were all put to face each other for one spot. Now, all the African teams basically boycotted the World Cup after they found it unfair that 3 confederations had to fight for one spot. And this left North Korea and South Korea from Asia, Australia from Oceania, and South Africa from Africa, who were put in the AFC qualifiers because they were banned from playing in the African regions. The format was created as a single table round in which the 4 teams would face each other twice in a tournament in a home and away style that was to be hosted in Japan. However, FIFA then banned South Africa indefinitely. Meanwhile, South Korea withdrew from the qualifiers. North Korea was then left to face Australia, and even that soon proved difficult because of politics. Japan turned down the hosting rights, so now North Korea and Australia would have to find a new place to play their 2 matches. Politically speaking, North Korea didn't have much relations with many of the nearby countries, as well as they didn't have a FIFA standard stadium. Meanwhile, Australia's immigration laws at the time wouldn't have allowed the North Korean football teams into the country. So, fortunately, a neutral ground was found in the form of Cambodia. So, North Korea was the victor after winning in aggregate 9-2, leading to North Korea to qualify to the World Cup for the first time. Starting from the 1970 World Cup, Asia and Oceania would continue to compete for one spot. Japan, South Korea, and Australia played in the first round. Australia would come out on top and be placed in Group 1 of the second round against Rhodesia, modern-day Zimbabwe. From what I found, Rhodesia was an AFC member until around 1980, since their history up until that point mirrored much of what South Africa was going through. Australia would win the group. Meanwhile, Israel would win their group after beating a debuting New Zealand. North Korea was in this group, but they refused to play against Israel. And so Israel and Australia would then play a two-legged match to determine the sole participant at the World Cup from the AFC and OFC nation. Israel would win on aggregate 2-1 and would attend their first and so far only World Cup appearance. The issue that nations didn't want to play against Israel were starting to take a toll on the Asian Confederation, as after this, Israel was basically pushed out of the organization, and by 1980, they were officially out. For the 1974 World Cup, more Asian nations finally started to join. The format for this World Cup had 2 rounds. The first was divided into Zone A and Zone B, where each zone had their own tournament-style format with a group round and a knockout round in which the winner of the zone would go on to the final round. The final round was simply Zone A versus Zone B champions in a two-legged match to determine who takes the World Cup ticket. And in the end, Australia would win the sole ticket to the World Cup, marking the first OFC member to appear at the World Cup, which subsequently meant that no Asian teams from the Asian region qualified to this tournament. For the 1978 World Cup qualifiers, the region's format was changed to 2 rounds. The first round was 5 groups in which the first place of each group would advance to the second and final round. The final round consisted of 5 teams facing each other, and first place would take the World Cup ticket. In the end, Iran would end up taking the top spot and would qualify to their first World Cup. For the 1982 World Cup, the AFC and OFC qualifiers would get 2 assured spots at the World Cup. The format was basically the same from the previous qualifiers, except there were only 4 teams that would play in the final round, and first and second place at the table would win the World Cup tickets. In the final round, won first place, so they qualified automatically. New Zealand and China had to play a playoff match as they tied in points and goal difference, since the goal in favor or head-to-head rule wasn't implemented yet back then. New Zealand would come out victorious and would qualify for their first World Cup. Meaning, this is the only time that an AFC member and an OFC members qualified from the same regional qualifiers. And so after this, for the 1986 World Cup, the AFC and the OFC would finally have their own qualifiers separately. And so finally, we have the 6 separate continental football organization that gives us all headaches. The 1988 World Cup qualifiers were the first time that they felt cleaned or organized. It still needed a little bit more simplicity, but it was a good start. The format returned to a Zone A and Zone B, format in which the winner of each zone would qualify to the World Cup. And these would end up being Iraq, winner of Zone A, and South Korea, winner of Zone B. Okay, so it finally feels like stuff at the world stage is starting to take off. So I'm going to take a pause there. I'm going to come back so I can talk about the final editions of the AFC Asian Cup.